Well, I'm just going to let you start in about what the spark is, why it's important, why people need to know about it, and what people can get from knowing about that. So,
okay. So I was thinking about this on the way in, and like I said to you right before we started, traffic was 10 times worse than it normally is. And this call I knew was going to go live at 9. And so I started really getting in my head, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Am I going to be on the phone? Like, how do I do this? And then I'm calling people in my office saying, can you start my computer? And they say, no, we're in this traffic too. There's a huge accident, so we're not there either. And as I'm doing this all in my head, like this soft reminder, Brooke, you don't have to worry about this. It's going to work itself out. And wouldn't you know, 3 minutes to the start of this call, I was here, I sat down, I turned on the computer, and I just had to laugh at myself because I'm rushing and not trusting that something else has my back in the moments leading up to a call where I'm going to talk about how you have to trust your spark. So that's the best introduction that I can give to what we mean by trust your spark, meaning, and we go back and forth when we talk about it. So we work mostly with youth and we talk about trust your spark and trust the spark. And even you and I had this back and forth of what are we going to call this webinar? And that to me, like just that knowing that I can trust there's something else running the system, that I don't have to be in charge of it all. Like, I left my house in plenty of time. You know, it wasn't my doing that I just laid around and then waited to the last minute. I left my house in plenty of time. So trusting that there's something else behind the scenes that's taking care of it. And even if I was a few minutes late, I'm pretty sure that the YouTube wouldn't have crashed. That, you know, I know there's so many people on here anticipating this, but it would have still been okay. And there's something to that. I remember, you know, I mean, there's a massive something to that, right? I remember when I first started learning about how the mind works and how we create our own experience from within. And we talk about in our field that you get insights that are kind of transformative. And a lot of times the insights that people get, other people just look and they're kind of like, really? Of course that's true. Why is this such a big deal? But one of the things that really, really stuck with me right away was this idea that we have our own wisdom inside of us. And it's almost like our own GPS system. And we're not in control of all the little things. And I was one of those people that was really anxious, but didn't understand that's what it was. You know, I thought anxiety was debilitating, meaning you didn't do anything or you were afraid to do things. And I was never that person, but I was the type of person that spent a lot of time in my head trying to figure things out before they happened. You know, I planned everything down to like every penny was budgeted in my budget because I had to plan everything out so far in advance to make sure I covered all my bases. And I didn't realize what that was me being really anxious about making sure I had control. And I can remember one of my very first insights was, oh my gosh, 99% of everything that I plan for or worry about never really happen, never actually happens. And here's where the spark comes in and trusting your spark. If it does, there is like this natural system within us that has the answer when we need it. So of course we're not going to have the answer before we need it. It's real time, right? So even when things happen, we have this way, the system inside of us that will guide us through that. And if you look at any kind of situation that you've been in, you'll see that's true. Like when crap hits the fan, right? You know how to deal with it. 5 minutes before it hit the fan, you wouldn't really know. You could guess, you could plan, but you wouldn't know. And for me, that was, oh my gosh, that took so much off my shoulders. Knowing that I wasn't running the whole system. Like I was not in charge of it all, right? I really thought I was for a long time. But two, that's not even scary. Like I used to think I needed to have control of it all in order for things to go the way I needed. But that's not even scary, because when things happen, we have this spark inside of us that will guide us through. And so that's really what I've learned about trusting the spark, whatever's going on, around us, whatever's running the system, and your own built-in system. And the last thing I'll say about that is, and because I'm sure you have some questions, but the other really like freeing thing, I guess, about this is realizing that I'm not special. It's not just me that has it. Everyone has it. Like, so I didn't have to control my husband anymore or my kids, because, oh my gosh, they have it too. Like, we're all in this kind of together, and we have our own wisdom inside of us. We have our own spark inside of us that gives us our answers when we need them.
Yeah. And what's coming to my mind now is thinking about young people who are caring for other people. The reason that came to me was because when I was young, I didn't have people that I had to care about, but I felt responsible. I always felt responsible for my parents and my sister. And from when I was really tiny, I had this idea that I was responsible for all of those things, for their happiness and their health and all sorts of things. And it wasn't until, despite all my psychotherapy training and my therapy, all the other therapy trainings that I had, it wasn't until I came across this understanding, or just before, that I realized. So when I was about 50 or something, it came to me that actually I wasn't responsible.
Yeah.
And that's pretty important. And funny enough, how I came across that was, it was when my mother had cancer, and I felt responsible for finding another alternative cure for her, and I didn't know what to do, and I heard, you need to sit down and ask for guidance, right? So I sat down and asked for guidance, and I was given guidance, which was, you're not responsible. And I had never heard that in my life, but all of a sudden it was really, really clear. You are not responsible. This is their journey, and you can be there for them, and you can support them, and so on, and love them, and do all of that. But both of my parents, but you can't. It's not up to you to find another cure now. I was like, wow. And I'd always known that there was something else out there that was bigger than me. But I don't know why I felt responsible. Amazing, really. So, and there must be a lot of young people who are in that situation, who are caring for other people in the family who maybe do feel that responsibility. And I wonder if they hear it. So when you're working with young people, how do you get them to recognize the spark?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We, just going back a little bit on what you said, is we were planning this youth day recently, and in order to plan it, we planned this game. It was a fun game, but we asked 100 kids all these questions, and the answers I found so surprising, in the sense, like, so surprising, but also not. It was just very enlightening, in the sense that, like, one of the questions was, what's the top reason adults are unhappy? And I can't remember if it was the top answer or the second answer, but the majority of the kids said their children. They're unhappy because of their children. And so obviously, as a parent, I can see how that might come across that way in my house. But I also know that's not true. Like, these kids, they might see it that way, but it's not the case. But what I what I did see is, oh my gosh, how many kids think it's their responsibility to make, like, if they think that they can make their parents unhappy or happy, how much responsibility is on their shoulders for that. And then fast forward a few weeks later, and I can be pretty neurotic with my kids at home. I have 5 children at home, so I can, I can be pretty crazy. But a few weeks later, I asked my 14-year-old to do a podcast, and it was truly like, I was supposed to record one, but I had a meeting come up. She was with me that day. We're walking into my office, and I said, hey, you go record a podcast. And she said, okay. So that was the preparation. But the beautiful thing that came out of that podcast was that message. Like, the most important thing, what her spark tells her is that, I think one of the questions that was asked to her is, what's so important about understanding your spark and understanding this? What's so helpful? And what would you want your friends to know? And the first thing out of her mouth was that the difference she could see between her and her friends is she didn't feel like my happiness, or me and my husband's happiness, was dependent on her. And that's just such a huge, again, I didn't think about it until she said that. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a huge responsibility, right? To think that. And I can kind of hear the parents in the back of my head going, well, I mean, they're just going to go do what they want if they think that. But what I have seen with my 14-year-old, and I'll just speak to her because she's almost 15 and I feel like she's almost out of the house. I feel like she's grown up so much in the past few years, is there's no amount of me telling her what she should do that will create that drive in her or create her doing what I want her to do, right? But she has this navigation system, and when she recognizes it, she knows the next step that's best for her. And so, funny story is, she's in the 8th grade, she's going into the 9th grade, and in the States, if you once you get to the 9th grade is when all the grades count for college, right? So in 8th grade, none of that matters. It's just a pass or fail. You get grades, but it's not on your record. So if you pass, you get an A or an F or a D, no one will know the difference. You pass the 8th grade. So she's always done pretty well in school. She's never excelled, but she's done what she needed to do without much oversight. So I kind of took that off my plate. And the last 9 weeks, I get a call from the school and essentially says she's got 3 Fs and a D. She might not pass. And I'm like, exactly. You see your face? I could tell you that the face was not all that went. Like, I went into crazy mom mode. And when I settled enough to get a little space, which was about 3 or 4 days, right? Because I was furious, like, how could you do this? I trust you to do what you need to do. There was a moment in the car driving to school where I'm doing my whole, how are you going to do this? You have exams. You better get A's, because if you're not, you're going to fail. Because that's helpful with someone that needs to take some information in and do well on a test. And at some point in the car, it occurred to me, oh wait, she has her own spark. Like, there had to have been a reason that these decisions made sense to her. Maybe I should ask her. I mean, it was like me screaming like crazy mother. And if you're a kid, you know how this goes. Crazy mother screaming. And then all of a sudden I remembered, she's got her own navigation system. What's going on? And so I dropped into that place like within a millisecond. And I said, well, Jada, what's going, like, why did you think this was okay? And she said, Mom, do you really want to know? And I said, yeah. She said, my grandmother had just passed away, and there's been things, she's in and out of school. And she said, it doesn't count until next year. So why stress myself out with all we've had going on in the past 9 weeks? And she said, obviously, I'm going to pass. And for me, that was like, oh my gosh, I don't agree with it. I still don't like it. Like, as the mom that wants the kid to succeed, I'm like, oh, but as the professional and the human being who knows that there's wisdom in these type of things, your spark is guiding you. She had a choice to make. Be there for our family in the morning, and we went, we had to fly out of state and all that stuff. My grandmother, or stress yourself out and study and do all the things you need to do and make sure you keep your grades up. And she had a choice to make. And it wasn't until after she finally passed and I kind of had a that I saw that, right? But the thing that your question was, how do you teach kids that they have their own wisdom, that they have this spark inside of them? The thing that really struck me after all is said and done is that she didn't get mixed up in my stuff, right? Like, I was freaking out, but she knows how it works now. She's done the test and like trial and error with her spark. She's really seen that my ideas of what's best for her are simply coming from thought in the moment. And her ideas, what's best for her, are also coming from thought in the moment. But there's this deeper knowing. And when push comes to shove and she had to deal with a death, like, that's not something she is accustomed to. But she just knew, like, I'm going to go here with my my presence instead of here. And when we talk to kids in schools or teenagers that are really struggling, we really just try to, like, when has that been true for you? When has it not made sense on the outside looking in to do something, but you have this knowing, right? Like, everything in your mind is going, oh, this can't be right. This can't be right decision. Getting 3 Fs, what? No, like, I have to do this. But inside, you just know.
So maybe people who are listening might not understand why it's not their responsibility to make their parents happy or not to make them happy, because that's a slightly different thing from the spark, isn't it?
So it is, but I see that there's 2 things going on all the time. And so fundamentally, when we talk to kids or humans and we're talking about how the mind works, there's this system that's guiding it all, right? We call it the spark. And it gives us each individually our own kind of guidance system. And sometimes kids say, well, my spark told me to punch him in the face. And what we say to that is, it's not really how it works, because the system that's guiding it all is like, that might be true if you're defending yourself and there's like some sort of fight or flight thing going on, but typically it's all working together for good, right? So that's going on. But then we have this human thing that's going on too, right? Like, this very real human thing. And that's our thoughts are generating in the moment, and they're creating every feeling we have, every experience we have. The way we see the world is through our thought system. So in just that example between me and my daughter, in that moment, my thought system was like, you don't get Fs, like, that's crazy. And her thought system was, I have a choice to make, right? I can either focus on my family or school in this last 4 weeks of 8th grade. And that's going on all of the time, right? All of the time. The way we see things is going on through our mind only, all of the time, through our thoughts only, all of the time. So if that's true, getting back to the parent child-parent relationship, if that's true, there's not much I can do to force thought and experience through my daughter. Meaning there's not much I can do to make her have a better experience. That has to come through her, right? And that's the other part of, like, the flip side of her knowing that that's true about me too. So there's not much she can do to force my thought to come into my head and then me have that experience. And so when you really see that and you trust your spark, that's, again, going the greater good, if you want to say that. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it looks really true to me. It doesn't make much, it's not personal, right? And it doesn't make much sense to kind of act in a way that, any parent knows this who's ever been a parent, like, to try to control your kid is just about useless, right? So the job really is to get them to see something so that they behave differently or in a way that's better for them. But the same goes for the parent-child relationship too. There's nothing that I can do to make someone do something else or behave in a way that is different. They have to see it differently themselves. And the reason that is because your experience comes from your thought in the moment. So if you don't see it differently, you don't do it differently.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can remember when I was a very young child, my father saying to us, "Oh, if you loved your mother, you would do this. And if you loved your mother, you would do that." Right. And what's interesting looking back at it now is that I took on, I thought that was true. I thought what he was saying was true. And so I started to listen to that thought. But obviously, when I was a baby, I didn't have that thought, and that wasn't part of me. And when we're babies, we're not trying to make our parents happy. Oh, but we can't. That's not right. And at the same time, my sister had a completely different experience. So she didn't listen to that. She didn't take notice of that thought and didn't listen to it. And so she had a completely different relationship with my parents and she did the opposite. She did things that he didn't like. Whereas I spent all my time trying to make them happy and trying to do things that would please them. And at the same time, because I was listening to that thought and believing it, thinking that I wasn't really good enough because I had to do things to please them, which is crazy when I look back at it now, but that's so common, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my mom just lost her mother, and they spent their entire lifetime in that kind of cycle of my mom trying to please my grandmother not ever really being happy. And so it's a losing battle. Like, can you imagine, like, at some level, your sister, when your dad would say that, your sister was like, for whatever reason, was like, well, that's not true. Right? That's not true. So because in her mind it wasn't true, she didn't follow that. But the same goes for you, like, because in your mind at some level you thought, oh, that's got to be true, then that's how your experience was.
So what about bullying? Because bullying is a big issue, isn't it? And in a big struggle for some children in schools. So how do you explain the experience of bullying from the bully's point of view and from the person who's being bullied, in terms of what's guiding us and why we're, as an example of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's interesting because the youth that we work with mostly are from really high risk areas. So it's not mainstream schools, but very like a lot of kids have gotten kicked out of school, or they're in rehabilitation, or they're in the juvenile jail system, and they don't look at bullying as mainstream does, right? Mainstream looks at bullying in the sense that there's someone just being mean for no reason, and you must protect yourself from that person. And we go into the schools, they kind of, it's amazing because kids, and I would say maybe kids in general, this is a general statement, but adults view bullying in a little different, a different way than kids do. Kids can kind of see really clearly, like, oh, there's something going on with you for you to act that way, right? And it's interesting because being with kids, they kind of get that, like, oh, what's up with her, you know? Unless sometimes when it's you being attacked for whatever reason, you don't have that. But on the peripheral, they're kind of like, oh, what's going on with her? Why is she, behaving that way? Or and we kind of know that as well. Like, how many times growing up did you hear, if someone's mean, it's because they're insecure themselves? Or so we kind of already know what's going on. But when we talk about it in the schools or where we're working, we don't really talk to the bully, or we don't use the term bully, because that's not ever what's going on. Really what's going on is someone's having, it's kind of like mother-daughter, right? Like, someone's having thoughts that are creating their experience, and they're viewing the world, and it could be based out of insecurity or fear, or really thinking the other person did something wrong, and that's how they're experiencing life. And it's amazing because when kids start to see that, just like my daughter I never taught her that, right? I never taught her, don't take me personally. I never said those words. But when you start to see the only thing you can ever do is experience your thought in the moment, then it's so much less personal, right? It's so much less personal. And the funny thing that happens is when you're not, like, let's say you're yelling at me, if I'm not taking it personally, then I'm not offended. And when you're not offended, all of a sudden, like, there's this compassion that comes. And it can look different with kids, right? Like, they're not going, oh, are you okay? but that's what happens, is they're just not reactive. If you can see that someone is treating you poorly because of what's going on inside of them, and that that's the only way it ever works, it can't be because of me, it has to be because of what's going on in their head in the moment, then it's not personal. And that's just the default. Like, when something's not personal, there's no reason to be offended. The other thing I'll say to that is, there's this idea that you have to, in our culture, that you have to have high self-esteem in order to protect yourself from, like, that, a lot of confidence in order to protect yourself from bullies. And I just don't see that as true anymore at all. First of all, I've never met anyone who's confident all the time. And so what we teach in schools is, if you think about it, if you're with someone that you really trust, or you have no thinking about when you're around them, you're just really comfortable with them, maybe it's your best friend, or it's your parents, or it's a family member, and you can just truly, like, let your guard down and be yourself, you're naturally confident. That's just what is left. And that's always there. That's not something you build on. that's just something that happens when you're not in your head and self-evaluating and thinking about how you're doing. I mean, and the only difference between someone who seems really confident and someone who doesn't seem really confident, in my opinion, the only difference is either they don't have much going on in their head in the moment, or they have stuff going on, they just don't care about it because that's just kind of system works, right? Like there's been 3 or 4 times on this call where I've gone, oh, did that even make sense? That's weird. But I know enough to know if I follow that instead of dropping back into something that makes sense will come up if I, if I don't follow that, confidence lies, you know, in your spark, not in your head, then I'm less likely to go off on one, right? Less likely to get covered.
Yeah, definitely. So what, when you're working in these special schools, in the schools where kids have had problems and so on, what are you working with? What struggles do they have particularly? Is there anything in particular, or particular struggles that they have, or ways that you work with them?
I would say, and I think this goes for all youth, but I would say 9 times out of 10, they wouldn't be where they were if they didn't know that their feelings weren't telling them about what they had to do next. Meaning, a lot of them there's either a drug issue or some sort of violence issue, or it could even be like a failing school issue, grade issue. And what I've just seen over and over that would probably be the most helpful thing for any human being is to know the difference between your knowing, like your deep note, your spark, which is you don't question it, right? Like when you know to do something, you don't question it. That's just the nature of your spark. Knowing the difference between that and your thought created feelings that look really, really real, right? Like it looks really compelling sometimes to believe in what's going on in your head. And if you don't know that all that is all that your feelings ever are telling you is what your level of thinking is versus what to do next. If you know that difference, then what our research has shown over and over again is like it just gives you that mental pause before you act. And that can show up in drug use. Like if I think that my feelings of boredom, for example, are telling me that I need to go do something, or my feelings of sadness are telling me that something's like wrong with me and the only relief I can ever have is using whatever my drug of choice is. If I think that's true, that my feelings are telling me that, then that makes sense, right? It just makes sense to go do that. One of the boys in the jail said the simplest thing, but it was so interesting how quickly he saw it. But we were talking about fear, and we were talking about movies. Like when you're watching a movie and you're afraid in the movie, but you kind of know it's not real. And we're having this whole 30 minutes, and they're talking about movies that they hate, they love, and they're all into this conversation. And we're talking about that's the way thought is. It's like a movie that's going on in your head all the time, and it's giving you this experience. And what would happen if you knew that the movie wasn't ever real? Like you didn't ever really have to act. And this boy, he was quiet the whole time. He goes, I wouldn't be here right now. And I said, oh, what do you mean? Were you scared of something? Is that why we don't really ask them why they're in jail. So I'm like, oh, were you afraid of something? Is that what got you here? And he said, no, I was just bored. I thought I was going to go crazy if I didn't go out and do whatever. And so his crime or whatever was just a reaction to his boredom, because like it felt real. Like, if I don't get out of my house and go, I'm going to go crazy. And he said, if I would have just known that that's just my my thinking, and that the nature of thought is that it's going to go away eventually and I'll have another feeling, right? Like, we're feeling things all day, every day. He said, I wouldn't have gone. And I thought, gosh, is it really that simple? Right? But you just think, like, you just look at like relationships that crumble, or or kids that fail. I mean, my daughter was telling me the other day, she wasn't progressing in one of her classes over the summer, and I was like, why haven't you called your teacher? She's like, I'm afraid. And I was like, oh, well, that seems like a silly reason not to call. And she just goes, oh, yeah, you're right. And she called. But simple, right? Your feelings aren't telling you about what you need to do. They're just telling you about where you are in your head. Because if we go back to the confidence thing, right? When you don't have much going on, you're naturally confident. Your default is to feel okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking that's pretty important when it comes to suicidal feelings, for example. Do you get to talk to people about that?
I do. And actually, it's funny. It's not funny, but it's the reason that I'm in this work is in 2012, just a short story, my brother-in-law committed suicide. And it took like a year, and I won't bore everyone with this story about my husband, but it took like a year, and then my husband reacted. Like, he didn't react for an entire year, and then all of a sudden he reacted. And it's how I got into this work, because he went into this really deep depression. I mean, in kind of a psychotic state where he was hearing voices. Within 3 months, he went from a completely functional human being to someone that I didn't recognize. And I started to learn how the mind worked, and he had a completely transformative experience around that. But yeah, that's what I thought. Like, what if my brother-in-law saw, like, whatever he was feeling at that time could not stay around forever, because of the nature of thought, and that thought, it passes. With every new thought, you have a new feeling. Like, if someone like, if they just see that, absolutely.
And how does a spark come into that? So the spark is not guiding you to do that, for example, wouldn't be guiding you to take your own life.
I would like to think not. I mean, there are some things in the universe I don't understand, but what the hope, what I know it brings is hope, right? When people feel at their lowest low, if they fundamentally understand how the mind works and how thought works, and how their experience is being generated, it doesn't seem hopeless if they see that in the moment. And sometimes people don't see that. I mean, there's plenty of things I know how I do this work for a living. I know how this works, and I lose it every day. So you don't always see it in the moment, but I do know that since I've learned where my experience is coming from, I can get really caught up. But there's always kind of like this small, it's just like this little kind of like, something's not right about this, right? That goes on in the background. So it's like you're having your full on experience, and then there's like this little going, hey, it's really quiet, and it's really peaceful. And that's what I attribute. That's how my spark shows up for me. It's like, this might not be true. Like, And it's just getting on to yourself. And so, yeah, I don't know. I hesitate to even answer it like that because I don't know how it all works, but it doesn't seem to me that that's true.
No, no. And also, uh, as you said about your daughter, that if people understand where their experience is coming from so that they think, oh, well, I can't ask anyone for help because of what they might think, or they wouldn't help me, or that's just more thoughts that once they realize that they don't have to take any notice of those, that maybe they would ask for help.
Yeah. And, my daughter struggles with it. She's struggled with that kind of thing since she was a baby. But for me, when she got off the phone, she came out and she's like, okay, I talked to her. I was like, so how'd that go? She's like, it's fine. I was like, huh, interesting. She's like, yeah, I got it. She's like, I already know. But it's like, huh, wonder what all that was about.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? That again reminded me of when I was young, because everyone used to think that my sister was very confident and that I was very quiet. But there were so many times when my sister would want to make a phone call, and this is before we had mobile phones. But when she wanted to make a phone call, she wanted to phone someone, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't, and she would want me to make the phone call for her. And it's so interesting, isn't it? What the number one, the appearance from the outside, but as you said, that some people seem confident in, and she was in some situations she was confident, and in some situations she wasn't, like all of us.
I was gonna say, like, we all are, right?
Yeah. And then in those particular situations, she was listening to some thought that was, I don't know what it was, but something that didn't make any sense, really.
Well, and I think that's like, that's where the true learning is and kids will see it with their friends so quickly. They're like, oh yeah, she does this weird thing and it makes no sense. And his friend's like, well, yeah, it does. And they all like, you can see it so clearly that all it takes is for someone to believe their thought is telling them something that's true. And that's the trajectory of their life until they don't see it that way. And it has nothing to do with how confident you are, that's not it. We're all confident, if not for our thinking that looks true to us.
So you said something about your daughter practicing something, or experimenting with her thought, or with her spark, or with noticing it.
Oh, her spark. So yeah, we do this with the kids a lot. And if there's any young people watching, I would just encourage you to do it, because and notice if it's something that you see. There's so many times where, and I'm sure you know this, where you make decisions that look crazy to people on the outside, but you don't question them. Like, you're not getting in that mental debate, like, ooh, what are they thinking about me? What are they not thinking? You're not doing any of that, because you just kind of know, right? That happens all the time. Like, we do that all the time. It isn't until we kind of start to self-evaluate when we get lost in decision making, right? We're making decisions all the time, and that's our spark just kind of guiding us. Like, when you walk out your front door, do you have to go, oh, should I go right or left today? No, you just go, right? Because it's guiding. And if not for all the thinking that we put on things, we would do that so much more naturally. And so, yeah, any of the kids that we work with, we just start talking about that. It's like, is there a time where you didn't listen to that? How'd that work out for you? Right? Is there a time where, it didn't make sense for anyone else what you were doing, but it didn't matter? I mean, one of the biggest decisions I've made recently that was just such a clear example of that was bringing, I'm going through an adoption process, but when we first found out my niece and two nephews were in foster care, there was no decision. But every single person I've talked to about it, without fail, goes, oh my gosh, that's so great of you. So many people wouldn't do that. And for me, maybe that's true, but there was no decision. It was just to the outside, it looks crazy, but it was just, and I don't need a Medal of Honor for it either, because there was no decision. It wasn't like that, oh, I'm going to do the right thing here. It was just, and that happens all the time. And that's really, when we talk about your spark, it's like just this knowing. And we're really clear that your knowing doesn't always feel good. It's independent of your feelings. So sometimes you're in a relationship that isn't healthy for you, and and it breaks your heart to leave that person, but you know what I mean? So it can get confusing, like your knowing is somehow going to be like feel good all the time, or be easy, or it's just not. That's unfortunately, that's not how it works.
I was reading something this week about a man who dived into a river, I think, to rescue someone in a freezing cold river, and he dived in and rescued them, and everyone, just the same as you, was saying, oh, you're so wonderful, and that was such a brave thing to do. And he's like, what? And he said afterwards that if he had thought about it beforehand, he wouldn't have done it. But of course, he didn't think about it. He just did it, as you said. Yeah.
And that's what your spark is there all the time. And we talk about how it can get covered with a bunch of thinking, but it's still there. You can't dim it. It's still there.
So if anyone watching wants to find out more about, is there a way that you share this with other people, or there are places where they can go to learn about this, other than watching more of these videos, obviously, because there are plenty of these around? But there will be a link underneath the video to come to where you are, and to your website, and to your Facebook page, and all of those things. How else is this shared? Is it shared everywhere in the country, in the world? Where can people find out about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over, but I would say through us, people use different words for spark. We use spark. And so we have a podcast. That's what I would say. If you like this kind of thing in small doses and don't want to talk to people like my daughter, there's a podcast. It's called Find Your Spark, which there's about 5 of us in our office, and we all work with youth, and we share every week, and you can hear my daughter's podcast on that as well. So.
Yes, I heard that one. It was very good.
Oh, good.
So, okay. So I think that's probably enough for people for one day.
Yeah.
I think they'll probably have got a lot out of that. And if they haven't, or if there's more that they want to learn, or they want to ask questions, they can post questions underneath the video too. And I will pass those on to you so that you can answer those.
Yeah.
And they can follow the links and find out more about you too. So thanks so much, Brooke. That's been really, really, really good.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And we'll speak again soon, I'm sure.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye for now.